Welcome, James.
So I won't say too much other than the fact that we've got a couple of fantastic talks before morning tea, and we have our third speaker for the morning already here. Thank you to everyone for coming. Had a lovely time last night. There'll be stories of all the mathematics that was done at the Trinity Bar, I believe, at morning tea. So we look forward to hearing the new theorems and new proposals that came out of that exchange. Please, thank you very much to Mahnoosh for presenting this morning.
Thank you so much for your for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm going to be talking about load management algorithms for electric vehicles that consider the fact that these vehicles are means of transportation. So I'm not even going to attempt to do a literature review on electric vehicles. There has been significant amount of work, a very rich literature to manage the demand of electric vehicles, especially in the distribution system. Now, I'm not saying all, but most of this work in this literature assumes that electric vehicles are essentially batteries that are stochastically plugged into the grid and require a certain amount of charge that will be specified at the time of plug-in, and then the vehicle will be plugged out at a later time that can be specified by the customer, and then the vehicle's charging load can be temporarily shifted to provide various services that support the grid, or to perform arbitrage or any form of sort of load management technique that you want to think about. Now, this talk's focus is to acknowledge that EVs serve transportation needs. And so in order to describe their load flexibility or to affect the behavior of humans, their vehicle's owner, we might want to consider the fact that these vehicles are not your average appliance in your home. They're not your dishwasher. So depending on the mobility scenario, of course, the load flexibility of a vehicle or a vehicle fleet can vary. I'm showing some scenarios here. 3 of them I will discuss in this talk, or maybe 2, depending on my time. 2 I won't be discussing. Electric buses is one. We're actually performing a test trial to perform electric vehicle demand management on 32 electric buses at Stanford. We have already essentially outfitted the buses with smart charging units, and we're going to this year test out various smart charging algorithms on them. Another scenario I won't be talking about is a company parking lot, for example. Here in this case, the only congestible resource is not really electricity, it's also the parking spots and the electric vehicle supply equipment. These are shared resources, unlike your home where you have a personal electric vehicle charger. In this case, that's not true. And so you have to jointly manage essentially these resources together. We're also part of a test trial that's going to perform smart charging algorithms mostly for emergency services and demand charge reduction at a large company parking lot with 800 electric vehicle supply equipment. Now, these cases are real, they're dirty, they have a lot of real aspects to them that I'm not going to be discussing at all in this talk. In this talk, as you'll notice, I'll have a lot of stylized models, and so please don't judge me harshly for the some unrealistic aspects that will emerge in some of the models. It's just to make them, amenable to analyzing. So, what will I be discussing in this talk? Going to start with a very 2050 scenario, and you'll see why. I'm going to be discussing autonomous mobility on demand vehicles. What are they? They are your Uber vehicles or your Lyft vehicles without drivers. So they're owned by a fleet operator. They're driving people around, and you can smart charge them, right? And so you can imagine how it's easy to perform mobility-aware demand management in this case. I have full centralized control over the vehicles and what they're doing, and so I can manage that easily. And humans are completely out of the control loop here, except for how I price the rides. So whether they want me to drive them around or not, right? Other than that, they have no role. I can easily sort of put them out of the control loop. The second part is charge management and not just charge management, charge and queue management in public charging stations, either through congestion pricing or through differentiated services, and I'll tell you what that means when we get there. And then the third part, if I have time, I'm going to be speaking about something that has been considered a lot in the literature, but from a different angle, and that's real-time pricing for home charging, but in general also other types of loads, but we'll see what that means. So you'll see that we'll sort of, as we progress towards the end of the talk, I'll go from more model-based and simplified models to a more sort of learning-based and general models. And we're also going to progress back in time from 2050 to 2010. Okay, so first part, as I said, I have a fleet operator that's managing these vehicles. If you sort of, for now, consider the humans out of the control loop, this guy would want to manage the vehicle so that you can minimize a summation of different costs. It could be travel time, when vehicles are carrying passengers around. The second cost, mileage costs, may not really make sense unless you sort of know more about this literature or you think about it. These vehicles are driving people to different places, and then maybe when I drop off the passenger, there might be no one there, so I could take them back somewhere. Maybe I've driven you to somewhere really remote, and then I have to drive back empty to another location when there's demand, and so that's called balancing or rebalancing in this literature, and it's associated with a cost. And then the third part, which is my interest, is electricity cost, right? And so essentially what such mobility-aware demand management does is it creates a coupling between the power network and the transportation network, which, as you can see, sort of it has been a hot topic the past few years. It's been sort of looked at from different angles. We'll see some of my work in this area throughout the talk. What is the idea behind modeling load flexibility? In this case that I showed you, we essentially use network flow models. We take the transportation graph and we create this expanded transportation network that has different energy planes. As vehicles are, it's very simple. As vehicles are charging, they move from lower energy planes to upper energy planes, and when they're traveling on roads, they move from upper energy planes and to the lower energy planes. And we sort of track their energy state and location throughout time as they're driving people around or charging. And so you could imagine how this can be used to perform load management. I'm not going to present to you the mathematical notation. I want to have some time for other parts of the talk. I'm going to show you one numerical experiment, which is rather controversial. We're going to use the commute patterns in the city of Austin from real data. We're going to replace 20% of it with demand that is served through a fleet of autonomous mobility on demand vehicles. So 20% of the commute patterns in the city of Austin, and we're going to couple it with a 2,000 bus model of the Texas Power Network, which is synthetic. And we're going to look at the LMPs. And the first row is showing you the LMPs in the baseline case that we have created. That is the LMPs with just no electric vehicles, right? The second case shows you what the LMPs would be if the vehicles were smart charging, performing V2G with some battery wear and tear cost, and then their load flexibility was coordinated with the power system operator. We use some form of distributed optimization algorithm to do this. And so what they do is essentially, even though the electricity demand is increasing across Texas, they're removing congestion at various hours. As you can see, the dots are no longer red. And the reason is that, of course, they're injecting energy back into the grid, right? As that's the controversial aspect. I'm not really saying let's do V2G with these vehicles, but as sort of the easiest thing to display when you want to show sort of how you can play around with these things. Otherwise, they would increase the LMPs and sort of costs or everything, so I can't really do much. The last one, the uncoordinated case, doesn't coordinate with the power system operator. Is still performing smart charging, but is trying to forecast demand forecast the prices day after day and self-schedule the charging. This one, it's saying that essentially, even though electricity demand is increasing, the total electricity cost is decreasing for the other customers in the system. Okay, so as I said, static network flow models, not the best technique to handle real-time dispatch solutions. I have these vehicles that essentially have to be sent around. That's sort of a 0-1 decision, right? And these models are not really great at handling dynamics, and a lot of things in this picture are dynamic, right? And so another thing, for example, we have tried is an online charge management technique that is deciding in real time where to route the vehicles and whether to charge them or not. And we have compared the performance of our online algorithm against the offline solution that knows everything about the problem in advance, and we can't really solve the offline solution. It's a huge integer program. So we're showing you an upper bound in this case. Okay. So that's a little bit of an introduction, and now I'm going to be talking about the role of humans, right? As I told you, I can price these rides to sort of affect whether humans want to be driven around to different locations. And so what I'm showing to you here is a very simple model. It's not the same model we used in the simulations that I was showing you, to look at how we can price these rides jointly with the dispatch of routing and charging to maximize the profit of the operator. It's a very easy optimization. The constraints are essentially on that expanded transportation network that I showed you. But what I want to show you is the optimal prices. They have in them a summation a weighted summation of the Lagrange multipliers, lambda ij, that is the shadow price of being driven between node I and node j. And if you look at it, the shadow price has two components. There is an electricity cost component and a mileage cost component, right? And that sort of emerges anytime you want to do mobility-aware charge management, right? That you'd have to jointly look at what is the transportation cost and what is the electricity cost. It's very easy to showcase in this case. As you can see, the prices that I'm deriving are only origin-based, that you can do origin and destination-based pricing as well. And the alpha ij is the portion of vehicles that want to go from node I to node j once they go in a vehicle at node I. Yes? Yes. In this case, it's very simple. It's just one-time units for all ij time. That's because we wanted to sort of derive a very clean formula. But in the previous case, I would show you we're tracking sort of travel time. We can even formulate sort of the effect of the autonomous mobility on demand fleet on congestion on roads. But this one? This one is very simple. We have a network, and the delay of going from each node to any other node is one-time unit. But in the previous case, the one I was showing you, it was capturing everything sort of about the time delays and everything. As I said, this is sort of a toy model to showcase the effect of humans and how it emerges in the prices. Any other questions? Cool. So part two. Part two is on fast charging stations. So we're going to be sort of looking at some things before we start on this. So why am I even talking about fast charging stations? Really, there's no smart charging opportunities in fast charging stations unless there's battery swapping, and that's sort of out of the picture by now. And so if you look at sort of any sort of demand management in fast charging stations, it's only about sort of the effect of the load on distribution system, or if you want to do solar energy integration. But it's mostly about these queues that form at charging stations. If you talk to a Tesla owner, that's a big deal, right? You could go to a fast charging station and there could be an hour and a half wait and you won't know.
Well, they like it if there is a nice coffee place.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, I'm going to use a rational, human decision-making model here in this case, but I was talking to Tesla about this problem. They wanted me to freely solve the problem without providing any money for any grants. I said no. And they were saying that these people just go here to hang out. But they like going to the fast charging station because they can meet other Tesla owners. I'm not dealing with that in my problem. Okay, so What factors affect an EV owner's decision to go charge or not? Charging prices, they're free here. They're free in most workplaces, by the way, as well. And that creates these, perverse incentives that we're not modeling. Charger availability, right? If there's a long queue, you might not want to wait in it. And then access convenience. If it's right next to a highway and you're traveling, you would prefer that. Or if it's right next to a coffee shop or Whole Foods, maybe, for these people. Okay, so important factors in this problem: no smart charging potential once the vehicle is plugged in, right? They just want to get out. It's kind of like a gas stop. And another issue is this long queues, which is creating charge rage instead of charge anxiety. So there's actually quite a lot of fast charging stations around right now, for example, in California. So people are not really worried about having access to a station. It's about worrying about how long they have to wait in the queue to get access to a charging facility, or an electric vehicle supply equipment. There is some previous work. Again, this is literature review, is not complete. This is what helps me talk about my part. The most literature in this case is focused solely on admission control in this sort of network of service stations, and looks at it as a queuing network. I have worked on this problem a lot in the past few years from a different point of view, where we perform joint electricity and congestion pricing by modeling the transportation network using traffic assignment models. And if you're not familiar with that, I'll tell you a little bit about what that is. So essentially, we take the transportation network. This is more than just fast charging stations. This is your daily mobility activity. You have access to a charger at home. You have access to a charger at work. You have access to chargers at fast charging stations and such, right? And so you can, as you want to go sort of move between different origins and destinations on the network, you or your Google Maps can decide where it's more convenient for you to charge, right? Most likely it's going to be home or work. 54% of charging events happen at home, 39% happen at work, the rest happen at fast charging stations or public chargers, right? So you rarely go to public chargers or fast chargers. It's mostly home or work, and it makes sense, right? So what these models do is essentially sort of track the fact that you have access to a charger at home and you have access to a charger at work. So if, for example, someone is doing some pricing technique that wants to shift your load once your vehicle is plugged in at home, you might just entirely shift your charge to the next morning and charge at work, right? So it's not like you only have that option of charging at home, and this is what these models are tracking. Now we have models that capture different complexities in this problem, but in almost all of them we define the so-called wardrobe equilibrium, which is the equivalent of Nash equilibrium in transportation network. And we sort of look at the type of equilibrium that emerges under different pricing schemes and in different sort of conditions. And we perform electricity and congestion pricing, we design electricity and congestion pricing schemes that manage demand in these networks. What is the issue with this? When you actually want to apply it to a real problem, you almost never can. So these things have been studied widely in transportation systems, but they're almost sort of always used to generate sort of insights about the actual pricing or toll design problem, and we're sort of in the same boat here, right? So if I want to manage the demand of charging stations here in San Francisco, and I want to see what is the equilibrium pattern that emerges if each person was to make their own charging decision, this is not an easy problem to solve, right? So if you look at all the real aspects of this problem, people have non-homogeneous values of time, various dynamic charging needs. You don't know their travel patterns, so you can't really formulate that optimization problem that I was showing, or I haven't even shown you the optimization problem. But so then, in this case, really congestion pricing-based schemes do not generalize well. So what we did instead is to look at designing differentiated services for fast charging stations. And what are differentiated services? I'll tell you. So in this case, you're an EV owner. You arrive in the network. You have an energy demand, a value for your time, and you can only go to a few of the charging stations, right? You could go, say you're traveling between this location and that other location, and you're only able to stop at one of these 5 charging stations, right? And you could tell me those things, and then there could be a router that sends you to one of the stations that is in your preference list, right? And so based on what you tell me your value of time is, your preferences, and your energy demand is, the price you pay and the wait time you will incur, an expectation or wait cost, is going to be different. And so this is in fact akin to nonlinear pricing of electricity that has been looked at a lot, or maybe not a lot, but by multiple people, to provide differentiated services for demand response, essentially. For example, Professor Lowe has worked on this with Alien in 2012, and if you want an authoritative overview of what nonlinear pricing is, Shmuel has a very nice manuscript that I enjoyed reading. So, related work to our problem, these are not really demand response articles or anything. These are articles on differentiated services in queuing networks, either one queue or multiple queues. And that's essentially what we're doing here. These are multiple service stations, and we're sort of routing people to them, depending on their preferences. And so they have essentially inspired the type of model we're going to use here. We're going to focus on a single origin destination case, and not really just, that's actually bad wording. We're going to assume all the vehicles can go to all the stations, and that's not because what the paper does. The paper has the charger preferences in there. It's just it makes the notation so heavy that makes it just unnecessarily heavy, and I don't want to do that. So let's assume everybody can go to all the stations. You have V values of time and E different types of energy demand, right? In the population, and each of these different types have a potential arrival rate, lambda ij, that you know as the system designer. And what is potential arrival rate? Those are people that have different that type and can arrive in the system. Those are not the type of people that you will be serving. Those are just potential customers. What is our service model? We are going to design a menu of differentiated services associated with each of these types. And our number of or types of differentiated services are going to match exactly our user types. We're going to price these service options at a price Pij to be determined. And the services are differentiated in terms of their routing policy, right? So if you are a CEO and you purchase the highest value of time option, then I will send you to the station which has no wait and is right next to the station next to your company. Whereas if you are an average person or an academic person, I might send you to the middle of nowhere to charge your vehicle here with this tumbleweed. And so the services would be different in terms of the expected waiting costs that people incur, and that's include the cost of driving to the station and then the queue that can form there. This WK is the wait at station K. This is the routing probability to station K, and that's the expected wait time for type IJ. Any questions before I proceed? Cool. So I don't know WK, right? That should emerge as a result of people making their decisions of buying service under different types, right? So that's what we're going to describe, right? How people make these decisions. So each user type solves this utility maximization problem to choose their service option, which might not match their true type, right? The assumption we've made here is that people are inelastic in their energy demand. So if they need a certain amount of energy demand, they can only choose to buy more energy than that. But they can lie about their value of time. This will induce a Nash equilibrium of effective arrival rates. Those are people that choose to buy service from you. It's different from the potential arrival rate. And we'll determine those WKs that I showed you, right? If you know the R's and if you know the WKs and if you know the lambdas, you can sort of relate them. Our focus is to design these joint pricing and routing policies that would lead people to only buy services under their true type. So if you're a CEO, I don't want you to buy academic people's service. So I'm going quickly because I promised 45 minutes.
Take your time.
What?
Take your time.
Okay. Did I go too fast? Are there questions? Okay. Socially optimal pricing routing policy. It's an optimization. I can formulate it. The first term is just the reward people are getting from buying service. Second term is the waiting cost they're incurring. Third third term is the electricity cost. Now those thetas could be your wholesale LMPs or your DLMPs, which is distribution locational marginal pricing, which could, signal the fast charging station about the distribution system's condition. You write the first order conditions of this optimization problem, you get prices associated with each IJ type of service, and in a non-surprising result, if you're familiar with this literature, these prices satisfy incentive compatibility constraints. So people will only buy services under the type that matches their true type. This routing problem is non-convex in general. I don't know whether that's a big concern if it has to be solved only once in this static case, but if it has to be solved dynamically, then we have looked at a special case of linear waiting times, which assumes that these service stations, the charging stations, essentially are modeled through hard capacity constraints. If there are eight chargers there, if I only send 8 people, there's no wait, and I won't send a ninth person because there's a hard capacity constraint. Okay, so everything is deterministic in this case in terms of arrivals. So if you only look at this case, there's a nice structure that emerges in terms of who gets assigned to what station. If I sort the stations in terms of this term here, which I know, then we'll see that essentially the customers with higher value of time and lower energy demand get sent to the most desirable station. This is kind of that CEO structure. Sort of the less desirable stations get filled in with this sort of diagonal structure, and then these customers don't buy services. And we can exploit this structure to solve that optimization, the routing optimization problem using a linear program. So this is easy in that case. Okay, so most charging network operators are not social welfare maximizing entities, they're profit maximizing entities. So that's the alternative optimization we've looked at. The first term is revenue from selling services. The second term is electricity costs. I don't care about the weights people incur and everything, right? Okay, the weights do appear in the constraints. That those are due to incentive compatibility requirements. If you ignore those constraints on W and solve for the optimal prices Pij in this optimization problem, you'll get a bunch of prices just as a function of wait times. And then you can check that these prices do satisfy those incentive compatibility constraints. So that's nice. We can solve both for pricing routing policies that are socially optimal or profit maximizing. Again, this one, if you replace the prices with what I just showed you, is still going to be a non-convex problem. But you can if you assume the same hard capacity constraints, this can be solved. It will still be non-convex, but we can solve it. So that's what we did. I'm here showing you a very simple numerical simulation with one CEO and one me, the academic. And you can have only 4 types of people in the system. The energy demand can be low or high, and then that's the value of time. In the first case, what I'm showing you is 3-station S1 is closer to the, or more preferable to both customers. 100% of CEOs with lower energy are being sent to the first station, if you notice. 100% of CEOs with higher energy demand are sent to station 2. 60% of academics with low energy demand are distributed between, 100% are distributed between S2 and S3. And then people who have low value of time or high energy and high energy demand are only accepted to the system 10% of time, or partially admitted. Now what I do now is I'm going to add a solar panel to station 3. What that does is it makes some free electricity essentially available at the least desirable station, and it changes sort of how the differentiated pricing system or whatever pricing routing policy allocates the CEOs, right? So if you look at what's happening to the CEOs, 60% of the CEOs with higher energy demand are here, but 40% of them are now sent to the further station that has free energy, essentially. Do you have any questions before I talk about part 3? Cool. Part MESW03 is a little bit different. It emerged because we were asked to be part of a trial to perform pricing, to perform load management on customers, but we weren't allowed to, perform any sort of centralized or distributed optimization to manage sort of their demand, which is the general theme if you want to perform load management in distribution systems. You either have to have a centralized market operator or an aggregator that's aware of the type of load flexibility people have, or there's some form of distributed optimization scheme that learns their load that allows the customer to coordinate to sort of clear the market. There are exceptions, for example, with thermostatically controlled loads, because they were, used since 1960s to perform emergency demand management. There are schemes that are only sort of communicating one way with the loads and observing only the aggregate demand. So this would fall in the same category. This is what we want to do here. We want to perform we want to perform real-time pricing to perform loads, but without any centralized or decentralized based centralized or centralized optimization. So what we're going to do is we're going to instead use a learning-based method, and you'll see what that is. What am I going to do? I'm going to assume there's an aggregator, or in this case, a price designer, that's going to post the price and only observe aggregate load, right? It's not going to see anything else. And essentially, the load flexibility of the customer population has to be learned from repeated interactions with the customers. Any questions on the setting? I have no other sort of, I can't analyze their smart meters, I can't do non-intrusive load monitoring, anything. I can only observe the aggregate load. This is a hard problem for many reasons. I want to, first of all, make sure that I want to minimize the running costs of the aggregator over a period of time. And why is that? Because over one day I can't do anything. It's an open loop strategy, right? Not open loop, I received the load one day later, but still. There are challenges in that the customer's price response is stochastic, right? You don't do the same thing every day, and it's unknown to me. I have a variable daily cost, maybe due to very different reasons. Maybe wholesale prices are different, the solar generation or behind sort of whatever distributed energy, whatever renewable energy that's being generated in the distribution system is different every day. Small size of the observation, I can only interact with the load this way 365 days a year, right? So if I were to do this just each day, I would minimize my cost, which is this general function G of the load's price response and the daily context that we assume is drawn IID from a finite set. And I want to ensure that distribution system constraints are not violated. Now that's odd, because I don't know how the load responds to prices, right? How am I going to ensure that? And that's sort of what makes this problem not very easy. What is our model for the load? We're going to assume the load is random, and we're going to model it like this. Now, this is what I did a lot in my PhD, so I know it's a little bit odd, but I'll explain to you what this is. This is saying the load can be clustered in, the load in terms of its flexibility can be clustered into Q clusters, and all the appliances in cluster Q have a similar type of behavior in terms of their load response. Maybe they are, electric vehicles that have to be charged between 6 p.m. and 8 a.m., right? And they're all managed by a home energy management system, so they have the same automatically the same price response, because this part, how each cluster responds to prices, is automated. What is actually the customer's price response is how many load types you have, right? If I send you a price, are you going to run your dishwasher, or are you going to have your HVAC setting on this specific parameter and things like that, right? So what have I done? I have described the expected load as a function of the response of each cluster's price response, and these coefficients AI of theta and PT, I don't know the parameter theta. I know the function form for AI, I just don't know theta, Is this clear, or are there questions? Cool. So essentially, based on the physical characteristic of the quantity I'm trying to manipulate, I am modeling what is unknown in this picture in terms of not knowing the parameter vector theta. And essentially, this unknown quantity will appear both in my objective and in my constraint, right? So if you have and I'm trying to minimize my okay, so what am I trying to do? This is my goal. I'm trying to minimize the difference between my cost if I knew the parameter theta. This is what this is. If I know the parameter theta, I can design the best price, right? I know everything about this problem. And however, I don't know the parameter theta. And so what I'm trying to minimize is my aggregate difference or regret that I incur at each time instant t from not knowing the parameter theta, right? So that's what this difference is, essentially. Any questions?
Sorry, this is a dumb one.
Please.
There's no sort of absolute value here.
Mm-hmm. Oh, these are all positive numbers.
So, so the G on the left is larger than the G on the right because of the L star.
Right. Because this one knows the parameter theta.
Yeah,
Correct.
just
These are all positive numbers.
Yeah.
Well, the expectations.
Yeah.
But the real thing. Yes.
Are the two G's also different?
No, the two G's are the same. The only difference. The only difference is this little PT star here. That's the optimum price because I know the parameter theta in this case, and I don't know the parameter theta in this case, right? Is that clear?
Yeah,
I know I formulated it a little bit poorly. I shouldn't have written it like that up top. Okay, so if you're familiar with multi-arm bandit problems, you'll know that this is sort of a very natural problem to look at under these problems. Since most of you might not be familiar with them, I'm going to tell you what they are. The name multi-arm bandits comes from this game of a gambler arriving at Vegas with N coins and a row of slot machines. And he's allowed to play any of the slot machines. Some slot machines are higher paying than others. So in expectation, they pay more if you play a coin in one of them, right? You just don't know which one is higher paying, right? So you have this game that you have to play against the stochastic environment, and you optimize which slot machine to play. Maybe you'll find a slot machine that's paying good enough in expectation, right? So we'll stick with that. Or you can explore different machines and see which one is a higher paying machine. However, you have unlimited coins, so you can only do so much, right? In terms of learning which machine is higher paying and which machine is not. Because if you had infinite number of coins, you'll first try, 20 on the first one, 20 on the second one, 20 on the third one, and find out which one is higher paying, but you don't have that luxury, right? So the same problem appears here. If I were to, freely choose different prices and observe the load, I could estimate the parameter theta, but I don't have that luxury, right? And so that's why I have a similar type of problem to this. There are two very well-known heuristics for this problem, upper confidence bound heuristics and Thompson sampling-based heuristics. The first one creates a confidence region in which the parameter theta lies with high probability. The second one is a Bayesian scheme, the Thompson sampling-based approaches. Now, if you're familiar with any of them, you'll know that UCB doesn't really generalize well to cases like what I was showing you. So you can't really apply to UCB to the problem that I was showing and still provide performance guarantees. So I'm going to show you some Thompson sampling-based results, but we've actually analyzed regret only for UCB because this is easy to analyze and this one performs well in practice. Okay, so essentially I have my load that appears both in my objective and in my constraint, right? And I want to, okay, sorry. Okay, so let me first tell you how Thompson sampling works. It assumes the availability of a prior on the unknown parameter theta. We, in fact, are collaborating with behavioral scientists who are running real experiments with customers about their load flexibility to try to learn that prior essentially. So we have an experiment with the Girl Scouts where we can, try to send them different prices that are fake. So the real bill won't get affected, but the girls will try to get their parents to do the right thing and they'll earn points. I know. Okay, so let's see sort of how this applies to that case. So let's assume I have collaborated with behavioral scientists to create this prior. Now how am I going to exploit this, right? If we ignore the constraint, this is how classic Thompson sampling would perform. In each round, it would draw a random theta from the prior. It would choose the best price corresponding to the parameter theta that I just drew from my prior. It will post it, observe a noisy version of this load, and based on that noisy observation, update the prior, and this would go in a loop for t periods, right? Problem, I have that constraint, right? So how do I ensure grid safety as I am performing this experiment? The easiest thing we first thought about, which is really not great, is to Lagrangeify the constraint. Not good. The second one is to ensure the constraints hold with high probability, and we have essentially specified conditions on the starting prior that can ensure Thompson sampling never violates the constraint as this algorithm progresses. I have maybe 5 more minutes, so I have timed this well. I'm going to show you numerical experiments first. So this is a distribution system. We have price responsive customers all over this, and the load models are feeder specific. And what this is showing you is what happens when I run a learning based scheme in this system. The first one is not safety constraint, and the second is safety constraint, right? So essentially the unconstrained case chooses prices that lead to the load being much higher than the limit, right? Because it's not really constrained with safety and it doesn't know the parameter theta. Whereas the safety constraint case acts really conservatively by sending really high prices, essentially in the beginning, to ensure that no constraints are violated, and in time sort of relaxes this thing, right? As it learns more and more about the parameter vector theta. Essentially you see that if you look at also, by the way, another case where the unconstrained case is not worried about the constraint, you'll see that the regret of the unconstrained learning algorithm can grow linearly, right? Because it can continue violating the constraint as it's sort of going. So there is no guarantee that the regret of the unconstrained learning algorithm would be logarithmic. What are the effects of the constraints on the regret? I can't tell you for Thompson sampling. In such complex online problems, it's really hard to sort of control the paths that this random process can take to analyze regret. So that's what we're actually working on right now for Thompson sampling. We have looked at a very special case with UCB, which is essentially assuming a linear cost subject to linear constraints, right? And we have looked at what is the effect of applying UCB in this case. Now what UCB does is it creates these confidence regions within which the parameter theta lies. And so what we do in the constraint case is ensure that the constraint is not violated for any of the thetas that lie in this confidence region, right? And so that creates this conservatism in the face of uncertainty for UCB. With regards to the constraint, we're still optimistic in the face of an uncertainty in the objective. We run this algorithm and we have analyzed the regret, and it increases essentially the regret with a multiplicative factor of, I think, t to the power 1/3 for UCB, which I'm not going to go through because I'm out of time. So essentially, that was my talk. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
I have a question on the Thompson sampling project. So in a lot of the applications I've seen, so for advertising, you can pull the arms a lot of times. Yeah, I'm curious.
You mean what do you mean you can pull the arms a lot of times?
Well, so you sample, you try something out, you look at what you observe a reward, and then you have multiple rounds. And
Yeah, that we have multiple rounds. That's why the T periods was, because if you have only one round, it makes no sense.
So in the case you have there, you have something like 1,000 days. If you want to do this in real life,
Absolutely, you have a very good point. So if you look at the regret curves, they're not really performing that well in the beginning. Sort of, it takes some time for the algorithm to find good estimates of theta. Maybe in the case I was showing you, it took 1,000 days, right? So that's what essentially signifies the need for the good prior. If you want to use algorithms like this, that's what essentially. If I start with a completely uninformed prior, like a uniform distribution on the parameters theta, then of course it's going to take many days for me to deliver anything that's sort of. Does that answer your question?
Well, in a way, I guess there are two things I'm a bit troubled with. One, so if the goal of this is to get prices, what the price of electricity should be at a given place, it means you have to try out a lot of different prices to see how people are responding. If it takes you even a day to know what the optimal price should be, by that time it's probably changed.
Oh, that's why the time varying context, and by that time it has changed. Oh, you mean the structure of the price response has changed? Well, I'm assuming the same type of people are living in the houses. Yeah, I mean, if it's a place where the customers are so dynamically changing and they have such different behaviors, suddenly like this person moves out and this other person with a completely lifestyle moves in. First of all, we're looking at aggregates, right? We're looking at many houses, not just one. Yeah. If it was just you and I was doing this with your smart meter, then that would be a very different issue. I agree. Yes.
Yeah, so there is some noise,
Yes.
and if I understood correctly, when you have the constraints, these are applied on the expected behavior.
Yes.
not on the noisy behavior.
So we have to assume all these Gaussianity for many of these to be able to calculate the.
Yes, but so if the noise is higher, then the probability of constraint violation will be higher.
Absolutely, yeah. So
There
there
is-
could be cases where there's absolutely no.
And you don't try to learn this.
Oh, for the constraints. Yeah, you're right. The expectation appears in the constraint, not with not the noise term. So what we have assumed is you can somehow learn what is the effective noise on this, and essentially, let me think about this a little bit. So the constraint with the constant c that I had on the right hand side, you should have to reduce the parameter c to make this safe by maybe thinking about the effect of the variance of the noise. Yeah, so we only had the expectation and the constraint. You're absolutely right. That was a very neat observation. But we thought about it sort of because the noise should also affect the constraint. But we can't really handle that, so we reduce the parameter c.
Maybe I can ask another surrogate question.
Mm-hmm.
So which is, you send the same signal to everybody.
That's correct.
You
That's
are
our
not obliged
constraint.
to do that in practice. You could somehow send different signals to different randomly selected subgroups of the population.
With real-time pricing, I don't know about the regulations on this. So that would mean I would have to essentially differentiate between you and your neighbor in terms of how I charge you for electricity. Unless you've volunteered for this, I don't think that's allowed, but I'm unsure.
But that's what they do in this online advertising system.
Oh, absolutely. In advertising, it makes sense, right? But that's no discrimination, right? But in electricity pricing, I think there could be regulations that, there could be regulations that prevent me from sending any price signal. That's why I'd assume the prices come from a predefined set, right? So I might not be able to send you a price that's $1,000, at 7 p.m. if you want to run your heart machine or something. Yeah, there's many things that have to. I totally agree.
Right now already, like if you're talking about 2050, we have certain regions, the prices of the houses are high because they have good schools. And maybe in 2050 we'll have certain regions where house prices are high because electricity.
Oh, absolutely. No. So in fact, when, for example, with some of Shmuel's work on distribution locational pricing, you'd have prices that are different under different feeders, right? But for individual customers that maybe live next to, I don't know. I actually don't know I don't know the politics of
The
this.
further away from the feeder, the more you have.
You're right. That's if you consider losses and everything.
We're worrying more about that you don't want everybody to come and to plug at 6 p.m. and overwhelm the system.
Right.
So you want to have some sort of this DLMP
DLMP, right.
scheme to spread the charging pattern so that you
Right.
avoid congestion in the distribution network.
Right. So it's not really sort of discriminating between customers, it's the feeder that you worry about, right? So
we have, let's have the hands up so
Yes,
we can
yes,
see
yes.
them.
Just one quick question, comment. What exactly are the distances involved when you send a customer from one charging station to the next charging station? And is there worry in the manufacturers like Tesla that this could actually create sort of a negative effect on the adoption of EVs? You're telling me where to go, and I may not.
only from the set of preferences you tell me.
Sorry?
Only from the set of,
What sort of distances would be involved here?
I
Because
have no clue, I haven't thought of, like you mean, like how far am I gonna send you from like your main travel route?
right,
That's
so
a function of how much you're
you
willing
have
to
those
pay.
three stations, S1, S2, S3, right?
Right,
And S1 is the most desirable.
right.
S2 is least, S3 was least desirable. What were the distances involved?
Oh,
If
in our
it was-
simulation, it was like 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles. It wasn't. It was kind of stupid. But say you have to. So you're traveling from San Francisco to Los Angeles. There's one station that is right next to a restaurant, and there's one station where you have to travel 10 miles, in an exit
Have you,
to get
have
to.
you looked at actual data? You said there was some.
Oh no, we
concentration
haven't
in
looked at
California.
real data for the distances of the stations because it's a kind of a 2050 scenario. So we've made it up entirely. But there is some of our other work that's based on these traffic assignment models that we have actually all the charging station information on the map, and we're using that. There was actually one more question.
There was someone else.
Oh yeah, sorry, I don't know
And we'll-
which.
yeah. Go ahead.
Question about kind of equitability. So I kind of understand how the Uber and Lyft model works for something that's kind of like a premium service, taking a taxi is not something you do every day perhaps. But when it's kind of personal transport that is, I guess in the US and parts of Europe, it's almost considered a universal right to personal transport.
Right.
How do you balance that against wanting to charge people very differently for levels of access to the service? When we put up the tax on fuel, we have riots. So are people going to be accepting, do you think, of very different levels of access to service based on willingness to pay?
I guess they are with Uber, right? I don't know. I mean,
But I think this plays into it, sorry, but Bart's point, right? So you pay more for a house because the electricity prices are cheaper.
Right.
But the people who can afford to pay more for a house can also afford higher
To pay
electricity
for-
prices. So the people who can't afford to pay more for a house, then do they just not get electricity?
right. No,
But that's a question.
that's like I think a bigger question for in general. If you want to use pricing to manage
I mean, I think it's a real issue, right?
any sort of pricing scheme that wants to manage electricity demand would be subject to the same criticism. And I guess how they handle that with electricity prices today is they provide subsidies to lower income neighborhoods. So I'm not quite sure sort of how that would.
When the customer pays a flat rate and the supplier takes the risk of price variations.
Correct. So we're passing this on to the customer.
Passing all
Right.
this on to the customer.
That is what we always do. We just pass everything to the customer at the end. Doesn't really matter what.
America.
It's always the same answer, guys. So there is no simple
I
way.
don't think it's a criticism, but I do think it's something that, in these models, people don't take into account, and it's becoming
The
a
social
preferred-
aspects,
Yeah, that
right.
social aspect is something. Maybe it could go in your cost function. I don't know.
I understand. Yeah, I think there's a lot of issues like this emerging, and that's why most funding agencies, for example, want to see collaborations between social scientists and engineers to make sure issues like this don't emerge when we actually propose engineering solutions. I think David had one question.
Oh, sorry, it's so quick. I just have a general thought about the details, which I may have missed. The fascinating thing about this problem is all the networks interacting.
Yes.
Social behaviour of people, the electricity network, transport, etc. And to what extent, well, to be specific, to what extent is the network, the electricity grid included such that you could help plan the grid or place charging stations?
So I wanted to, I wanted to show some of my newer work, but I have work from 2-3 years ago that considered this coupling essentially, again using very stylized models. The issue is, how do you bid the load flexibility of a transportation system with the power system operator? There's no really easy way. So the transportation network or the customers either have to self-schedule, or there has to be some form of distributed optimization-based algorithm that finds the optimal LMPs in the presence of such load flexibility.
So clearly this is on the horizon for future research.
Right. So,
In these networks.
correct. That's correct. Yeah.
Great. We were running 5 minutes late, so if there's one more question, we can have it, or we can move on to the next speaker.
I just want to make one little comment that the program, US program on nodes that a lot of people here participate in, has looked into some of these things. What is the social aspect of aggregating a lot of customers? Is that aggregators' responsibility to deal with the diverse little guys?
Right.
Or is it that
Government?
So, and I think what's interesting from the information and control point of view is that the schemes, the communication that you need to exchange between the aggregator with its customers or between the ISO are very different depending on who takes responsibility for which part of differentiation, basically.
Right.
So there is very little work I've heard on the, people reported these program reviews, but so it's worthwhile looking at the synergy.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.